Welcome to Equipping Leaders, a podcast where I share tools and perspectives to equip leaders in self-development and team connection. I am your host, Natasha, and I am excited to share today's episode with you. Today is the first episode that is dedicated to a book review. I enjoy reading books, and there are so many great takeaways, and I want to share them with you. Today I have the book, The Insider's Guide to Culture Change by Siobhan McHale. Culture is such a huge part of the workplace, as it should be, and there are a lot of ways to look at it, from an organization level to a team level. It does not matter what level you are in within an organization. Every person impacts culture. In the book, McHale identifies the key elements of workplace culture as mental maps, which are perceptions or point of view and the images that you hold, then roles, which are the parts played by a person, and finally patterns, which are hidden agreements and co-created rules between parts. There is a framework in this book called the Culture Disruptor that has 5 steps. The 5 steps are goals, consolidate, break patterns, reframe, and diagnose. Let's break those down a little. Starting with goals. What are the culture goals that you have for your organization or team? Be as specific as possible with what you want the culture to be and how you want people to feel. The next few steps are how you can disrupt your culture. So you consolidate the gains. When you consolidate something that you have, you strengthen it. Then you move into step 3, which is breaking the patterns. Patterns are often what holds a culture in place and makes it difficult to change or even move in a different direction. Then you reframe the roles. When we can get people to look at roles or rethink roles in a different way, it opens people up to see the Venn diagram that is most workplaces. In this step, it is important to remember that you're modifying a role, you're not modifying a person. Finally, you diagnose what's really going on. There are many things that shape and maintain culture, but when you move through these steps, you get a better picture of what the actual challenge is so that you can then actually resolve it. Once you diagnose what's really going on, there's still a lot of work to do, but now you know what you're solving for. If you move too quickly to solve a problem and don't take the appropriate time to diagnose, you could just make it worse. I had 5 main takeaways from this book. The first is that a bad culture can corrupt good people. I tend to view myself as a really positive person, and most of the people I work with would probably say the same. But if you ask people that I worked with at a specific past job I had, they may not say the same. Actually, I know that they would definitely not say the same. In fact, I can admit there was a culture that I was once part of that turned me into a toxic teammate. The environment was not consciously built, and there were a lot of self-serving people. When I first got there, I was fine, but after about 18 months, I had become someone else entirely. I remember being in a meeting and somebody asked a question, and the way that I answered the question, I just had such a tone and such an attitude that was that moment for me where I thought, like, whoa, this is not who you are. This is not how you want to show up. So I'm not blaming all of this on that culture because I do know that I had a responsibility in how I behaved. And when you're part of a toxic culture for so long, you adapt to that darkness. Some people naturally tend to view the world through a negative lens, but when you see good or positive people start to swing to the dark or negative side for more than just a little bit, that's a sign that there is something wrong in the environment. Something else that I loved was what the author called rule number 1, which is use good judgment in all situations. There will be no additional rules. I love the simplicity of this. When I was in the military and there was an event coming up where you didn't have to wear your uniform and could instead wear civilian clothes, they would give you a briefing on what civilian clothes were appropriate. And I always found this to be very funny. How about if, instead of wasting time building a slide deck and then bringing together dozens of people to be briefed, you just use the rule, use good judgment in all situations? I know people have said, well, what if someone shows up to work in flip-flops or in short shorts? And to counter that, this rule is perfect because it's like, is that good judgment? It's not. We can trust people to use good judgment. If something goes awry, that's where feedback comes in. Otherwise, let people use good judgment and don't weigh them down with tons of rules. Third, rewards send signals to employees about what's really valued within a culture. When something is incentivized, it basically puts a huge neon sign over it that says, focus here. In most organizations, people's contributions to the bottom line of the organization are what get rewarded. But what if you did not raise your numbers, but every member of your team feels supported and empowered? We can really influence where people look with rewards, so we need to be really smart about it. Another thing that I mentioned earlier around problem solving, but I want to dive into it a little bit more here, and that's if you move too swiftly to solve a problem, you could just make it worse. There is something that many of us, especially leaders, are prone to doing, which is to hear or see a problem and jump right into solving it. You may be able to solve some aspect of it, but that's usually just a bandage. We have addressed a symptom and not the actual problem, so it can feel like we're putting out similar fires a lot. We need to jump into the patterns and mental models that are causing these problems and resolve those, which we cannot do if we're rushing towards a solution. This also leads to my final takeaway from the book, which is that some leaders focus on the problems that they know how to solve instead of the culture issues they face. When we are familiar with the problem, we have more confidence in that area, so we're quicker and better equipped to solve it. However, as leaders, we have to be willing and able to solve any problem. It's our responsibility, which is our ability to respond. We're not going to know everything, but we can be great listeners, get all the information, and understand our resources. Then we really can solve every problem, and solving these problems becomes a lesson along the way. Those are my highlights from The Insider's Guide to Culture Change by Siobhan McHale. I plan to sprinkle more of these book highlights throughout future episodes so I can share my love of these great leadership books with you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Equipping Leaders podcast. For more leadership development content, you can visit my website, natashacheyenne.com, where you will find my leadership journal with dozens of articles, and the Cultivation Cafe, which is always growing and has leadership frameworks, book recommendations, and inclusion and mental health resources. You can also follow me on Instagram at novel_Natasha or at Equipping Leaders Podcast, and on Twitter at Natasha Cheyenne. Join me next week for another episode.